Well, hello to all you fine human beings joining us from all around the world. It's great to see so many people here. I think this is, we're at 240 right now. People keep pouring in. I think this is one of our highest attended of the year. So thanks all for showing up. So Psychedelic Science 2021 webinar series. Today's topic is psychedelics and integration. My name is Ryan J. Beauregard, and I'll be your host for this session. I work for the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies as the Zendo Project Programs Manager. And I'm honored to be sharing these timely and essential conversations with you all today. As an organization, we at MAPS so appreciate your attendance and support. With all the many options of how you can choose to spend your valuable time and energy, you've made the conscious choice to be here and now, gathered with this community, supporting the growth and learning of the collective psychedelic movement. And we're honored to be sharing these timely and essential conversations with you all here today. So I want to do some acknowledgements. First, I want to begin by expressing some gratitude for all of you who are here in attendance today, as well as those watching this video as a recording. These conversations wouldn't be possible without your participation. We also want to honor all of the indigenous peoples who have historical roots with plant medicines and have long recognized their healing potential. I'd like to recognize all the incredible women who have contributed a wealth of knowledge to the psychedelic field, as well as the pioneers of psychedelic research and therapy, and all the healthcare providers who devote their lives to helping people finding healing and care. The psychedelic field would not be where it is today without this collective dedication. And we are so incredibly grateful for all of you bringing your new unique gifts, passions, and perspectives to the table today and beyond. So I want to cover a few logistics before I introduce our speakers today. The first is to remind everyone that these sessions will be recorded and available afterwards. So that will be an email coming to you within about a week of today's session. Secondly, we have two American Sign Language translators, Jaron Whitehurst and Juliana Vidala. They will be taking turns throughout the session, and we'd all like to thank for making this event and this information more widely accessible to participants and the world. We also want to welcome everyone to use the chat area to converse during the webinar. Again, this is a safe space for open and honest dialogue, so please bring your most diplomatic, kind, and compassionate language to the Zoom chat. We encourage any conflict of opinion to be approached from a place of curiosity and mutual respect. We also have monitors who are monitoring the chat and will step in to support respectful conversational conventions. We do not tolerate any bullying, harassment, or trolling of any kind. So let's bring our best selves forward for these conversations. If you want to pose a question specifically for the speakers, please use the Q&A function. Questions posted to the speakers in the chat box will not be considered because they're easily lost in the thread. One other disclaimer, MAPS cannot provide legal, medical, or mental advice, nor do we advise on the use of any prohibited substance. To get back to the Q&A, just a reminder that you can vote on the questions posed by other participants to increase the chance of a response in our Q&A section. A reminder throughout the session to visit the Q&A window and upvote your favorite questions for our expert panelists to answer live throughout the webinar. You'll notice towards the end of the session, there are new and maybe sometimes potent questions that are added, but don't always get the upvotes because they're newer. So we want to encourage as a community today, keep your eye on that Q&A. There might be some really great questions that come at the end as some of these topics are introduced. So please remember that the upvoting is a living process that we want you to all be involved in. So without further ado, allow me to introduce to you my wonderful colleague and panel moderator, Merete Christiansen. She will be supporting this incredibly important and timely conversation about psychedelics and integration, featuring Ingmar Gorman, Ph.D., and Shannon Carlin, L.M.F.T. Merete is the Associate Director of Development at MAPS. Since joining MAP's team in 2014, Merete has provided administrative, operational, and programmatic support in her roles of operations associate and executive assistant to Rick Doblin, Ph.D. As Associate Director of Development, Merete coordinates the work of MAP's fundraising team through campaign and program management, grants management, and donor stewardship. Merete's work with MAPS is driven by her belief that all people should have access to the information and tools they need in order to heal themselves. Merete, I'll let you take it from here and introduce our wonderful panelists.
Thanks, Ryan. Hi, everyone. So happy to be here today and have the pleasure of introducing our esteemed panelists. So I'm just going to go through and read their bios, and then we'll step right into their portions of the webinar. So Dr. Ingmar Gorman is co-founder of Fluence, a psychedelic education company training mental health providers in psychedelic treatments. As a psychologist, he shares his experience in empirically supporting psychedelic treatments with his clients and trainees alike. Dr. Gorman received his clinical training in New York City at the New School for Social Research, Mount Sinai, Beth Israel Hospital, Columbia University, and Bellevue Hospital. He completed his NIH postdoctoral fellowship at New York University. He simultaneously served as site co-principal investigator on an FDA-approved Phase 3 clinical trial of MDMA-assisted therapy for post-traumatic stress disorder and is currently a study therapist on the same study, as well as another FDA-approved clinical trial of psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression. Dr. Gorman has published on the topics of classic psychedelics, ketamine, MDMA, and psychedelic harm reduction and integration. And I'll also introduce Shannon. Shannon Carlin, L.M.F.T. is the Director and Head of Training and Supervision at the MAPS Public Benefit Corporation, or MAPS PBC, a wholly owned subsidiary of the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, MAPS, which is a 501c3 nonprofit. As the Director of Training and Supervision, Shannon oversees the development and implementation of the programs that provide training and supervision to prepare mental health and medical professionals to deliver MDMA-assisted psychotherapy in approved clinical settings. Shannon started working with MAPS in 2011 before joining MAPS PBC in 2016. In her dedication to supporting people through growth and healing, Shannon has served as a co-therapist on MAPS-sponsored Phase 2 trials researching MDMA-assisted therapy for anxiety associated with life-threatening illness and MDMA-assisted therapy for severe PTSD. Shannon's direct clinical work continues to inform the development and implementation of the training programs she oversees. So grateful to have you both here with us today. So we're going to kick us off with Ingmar. So Ingmar, whenever you're ready, take us away.
Great, thank you. Thank you for the wonderful introduction. It's fantastic to be here and to see such a wonderful response. And I echo many of the introductions that Merete and Ryan have shared. So I'm just going to take a moment here to share my screen. So you should all be seeing this presentation here. I'll begin by saying that I took a little bit of a risk. So I did a 180 in the last minute, and I've changed the topic a little bit. We'll still be talking about psychedelic integration, but I'm going to be focusing on the therapeutic relationship. So you already have the bio on me, so I won't reiterate that. I do want to give a lot of credit to my colleague, co-founder at Fluence, actually current co-principal investigator of the Phase 3 MDMA trials at the site in the private practice site in New York City. She's a psychologist just like myself, and we work closely together in many, many places. Merete has been so kind to talk about Fluence a little bit. So our sort of two objectives. One is to train therapists in the community about psychedelic psychotherapy, psychedelic integration, psychedelic assisted therapy. generally helping clinicians become more educated about psychedelics. Another part of what our company does is also work with research and drug sponsors to help develop their psychotherapy manuals, to train study clinicians, to just provide more training materials. And so these are some of the organizations that we collaborate with. But today I'll really be focusing on psychedelic integration. That's why you're all here. And I'm going to give a quick overview over why this is relevant. Well, if you just think about the last 5 or 10 years, there's been a tremendous increase in interest in the general public about psychedelics. It's reflected in the media coverage about psychedelics. There's also an increase quantitatively in the number of scientific publications that have been covered. So there's just this trend, this clear trend that there's a wave of interest in psychedelics and their potential. And we also see this through what has become accessible. Ketamine is sort of its own exception, but sometimes people speak about ketamine as a psychedelic experience or a psychedelic dissociative, and that is a currently available treatment in the United States. And you probably are all very well aware of the legislation that has passed in Oregon, which is going to introduce legal psilocybin therapy in 2023. In terms of MAPS's effort for MDMA for PTSD, we aren't 100% sure, but there's a potential that could become a available treatment in 2023, and psilocybin may be closely behind, perhaps within a year. And as you may know, there are many other organizations investigating novel or other compounds for other indications. And so we may see a whole flood of new treatments. Yet, given all of this, there tends to be, what seems to be overlooked at times is that there are people who've been having psychedelic experiences, well, as Ryan had mentioned, for hundreds of years, depending on the culture that we're looking at, far preceding our own. But they're also, within our cultural context in the United States, there have been also people using, let's say for the past half a century, using psychedelics outside of a therapeutic or clinical context. There are a lot of different motivations or reasons for why somebody might want to use a psychedelic. And that tends to be neglected, particularly when it comes to the education of clinicians or just society at large in terms of knowledge about psychedelic use. And so I think that this is something that really needs to be addressed. And so one way that we've attempted to address this, aside from starting Fluence and providing trainings, is that we've published a paper called Psychedelic Harm Reduction and Integration, a trans-theoretical model for clinical practice. And this is an open access article published in the Frontiers of Psychology, where we go into greater detail about how we are thinking about psychedelic integration. And we very deliberately call it a trans-theoretical model because we are not dogmatic about how psychedelic integration can be conducted, nor are we presenting this as the only and the way to do it. We're hoping to start a conversation, at least within academia, about this very topic. And so if you are coming to this webinar and wanting to get a lot of detail about the psychedelic preparation and integration process as it occurs outside of research settings, as it takes place in the community, if you will, this is a great paper to turn to. And actually, I think that Shannon, who will be speaking after me, she'll be talking a lot about integration as it pertains to clinical trials and the MAPS work, but there's a lot of overlap between what she'll be speaking to in detail and what we present in this paper. So taking a little bit of a step back for a second, I like to think about psychedelic assisted therapy and integration through various, I guess you could say, paradigms. And one model that I like that Ingmar Gorman shared with me, and this is one lens that you could apply to doing psychedelic assisted therapy. There's a kind of passive aspect So this would be if we would be looking at just the biological effects. MDMA has an effect on the amygdala. It reduces activity, reduces fear response. So there's some sort of passive, it doesn't matter what the participant is doing, presumably this is still happening. Perhaps even some might say that there's some unconscious activity that's happening that might be maybe passive potentially. Then there's the experiential domain, which is what is the experience like? What is happening while a person is under the influence of a psychedelic, both internally and interpersonally, transpersonally. And then there's kind of this active piece, which is what is the person actively doing after their experience? And we can also talk about this through different lenses. A behavioralist might be talking about behavioral activation and what are the new kinds of behaviors the person is doing. Another perspective might be through the lens of living according to one's values and what's important to them, what a person chooses to do with the experience. So this is clearly connected to integration. Another lens that we could use to think about this process generally is the transpersonal. This is often when we're talking about mystical experiences. For example, all I was a single point of consciousness. So something, an experience that's sort of almost within us, but also beyond our sense of self. Interpersonal, which is a healing process that happens within the context of relationships. And psychotherapy is very connected to psychotherapy. And in fact, today, I really want to focus on this particular domain. And then there's the intrapsychic, which is this notion perhaps of the inner healing intelligence, that there's something kind of within us that we can tap into our intuition that can guide us forward. And of course, none of the things that I've mentioned here are mutually exclusive, right? All of these can be true. So before I started to come up with this talk, I was thinking about who my audience is. I'm always wondering like, who's in the audience, and like I can't see you and I can't talk to you. But I really want your time here with me to be spent well. And so when I'm thinking about how I'm going to speak to a general audience on the topic of integration, I find myself in a little bit of a bind because I'm not really good at telling people how to integrate their psychedelic experiences. And I actually kind of find that thought, even as I'm thinking about it right now, a little bit unsettling. Because it can turn into something like, well, you should do yoga and meditate and eat more healthily and engage in self-care and connect to your community. And actually, I do say that. I think those are absolutely true. But as I do that, I begin to feel a little bit like I'm becoming some sort of self-help guru or like a motivational speaker because I'm speaking to an audience. And I personally don't really like to be in that position. And why I work at Fluence and why I enjoy it is because often I'm teaching clinicians about integration, which is more about empowering them to support their clients in the integration process. And so what I really like about psychotherapy as a profession is that it comes with these agreed upon boundaries. And sometimes you can even modify those boundaries as long as there's mutual agreement. And of course, with the obvious exclusion of egregious unethical behavior. And you can even observe how these boundaries or the frame is altered between you and the person that you're helping or the client that you're working with. And the other thing is that psychotherapists follow this tenet that every action taken has to be in the service, ideally, or the best interest of their client. And so we're trained to recognize what that looks like, and also when we might be fooling ourselves about that, and also to then be forthright about that if we've made an intervention that's maybe more about us than about them, and perhaps talk about that or at least bring that to supervision. So ultimately, I have this unenviable task of not wasting all of your time if you're not a psychotherapist, and I hopefully am able to bring you something of value today. And so as I was thinking about this, the place where I arrived was of the crucial importance of the therapist, facilitator, friend, whatever role that you occupy. As you come here today, and you're listening to me, if you are wanting to help somebody in their integration process, the crucial role of the relationship. And in the world of psychotherapy, there's this often stated kind of fact that the therapeutic relationship is one of the best consistent predictors of people's improvement. And there's actual evidence, solid, consistent evidence that says that's true. And one of my colleagues once said to me, well, like, duh, right? You just don't be a jerk. Like, if you're going to be a jerk, the person that you're working with is not going to get better. And that's probably true, but I think there's a lot more depth and nuance to that. And that's sort of a whole entire university course, and I can't talk about that right now. But if you're interested in kind of that particular perspective, the relational psychoanalysts have written many books on the subject. So the reason why I'm bringing this up here with you is because I'm constantly reminded that psychedelic integration is not a solitary activity. You just can't do this work alone. Who we are, how we are, and what we do really matters when we're helping somebody with integration process. Perhaps more than any action that you take when you're facilitating. And recently I had a client of mine. She said, with genuine gratitude, she expressed to me that I help her be herself. That I help her be herself. And it made me think about my own therapeutic experiences, and it touched me very, very deeply, perhaps more deeply than anything anyone has said to me before in integration. And it made me think about how there's a softening that I've experienced after my own psychedelic experiences, and the impact of being witnessed by another person, how that impacted me. And for many of the clients that I work with, somewhere inside there's a pool of guilt, shame, stigma, rejection, all of these emotions with deep social roots, and conflicts between themselves, their who they think they should be, their ideal self, who they believe what the expectations are of their social group. And I do believe that psychedelics have the capacity to dramatically shift these relationships intrapsychically, within us. And some of these experiences that lead to that, they have this intense Gnostic kind of feeling to them, like, this realization there is no self, or I am a part of everything, or who I perceive myself to be is partly a story that I tell myself. Recently, a client of mine had said, he said, I came up against death, and it makes you wonder, what the hell am I living for? But what happens after that? You have to return to your social context, to relationships, it's inevitable. And I think that during this integration process, the kinds of relationships you have available to you is crucially important. The people who assist in the integration process have to be receptive, vulnerable, curious, and maybe most importantly, authentic. And why does that matter? Why does authenticity matter? Because the facilitator has to have the capacity and the potential to reject you. I want to think about that. The client has to know, or whoever you're working with, and whoever you are, whatever role you are, they have to know that the other person has their own subjectivity and receives the client despite the facilitator's capacity to be rejecting. And what gives weight to being seen? It gives weight to being heard and being witnessed. A psychedelic experience can be incredibly powerful, but the witness provides to the client a kind of validation and discernment. And paradoxically, it doesn't mean that we are the arbiters of truth. It's not like, we're as the witness saying, yes, this aspect of your experience is real, and no, that's not real, and this is good and that's bad. We might do that a little bit. We want to provide some validation, but our primary objective is to be another human being that the person can be with, the client in this case can be in touch with, and they kind of explore their own world in front of, if you want. And this is kind of my reservation about maybe just any random person doing this work. It's why I have some reservation about replacing therapists with technology, with like an AI, because an AI doesn't have the capacity, the potential to reject. So why? And it's also why people really, I think, need to be careful about their shadow, and they need to do that shadow work, because it's both, right? We can't just purely always be accepting. Now we can accept the person, right? So the humanistic psychologists, they talked about unconditional positive regard, right? And that means that we have unconditional positive regard for who the person is. But that can also include holding a person accountable and responsible. And so when my client told me that I helped her become herself, what I believe she was saying is that I helped her have greater acceptance of who she was, and that I was helping what's within her come forth. So before I wrap up, I want to just give that's a little like my diatribe about the therapeutic relationship and the importance of the witness. But there's some additional pointers that I thought it would be nice to offer before I wind down. One is, you and the person that you're helping with the integration process have a relationship, but each of you also have a relationship to the psychedelic. And this is part of the integration process. And you have to pay attention to this. Sometimes a cigar is a cigar, has been said, but sometimes not getting the right dose is not just about the dose. Another example would be, sometimes, the music not being just right during the experience is not, afterwards in the integration process is maybe about a person not really feeling comfortable talking about or feeling vulnerable about what their experience was like. And you have to be really careful with these kinds of interpretations. And in fact, we do very minimal of this in the psychedelic work, but it's something to pay attention to. Similarly, what is the transference to the psychedelic? What's the relationship like, again, between the client and the psychedelic and you and the psychedelic? Do you refer to it as a drug? I've been using the word psychedelic. Some people might say medicine, depending on the context or the compound. Or is it a grandmother? Is it a teacher? Often people can encounter a certain kind of honeymoon phase. This is another kind of relationship. And the honeymoon is a kind of time for idealization. So an idealization of the psychedelic itself or of the experience. And maybe there's a link here with the afterglow period, maybe not. I don't think it's totally necessary. But after the honeymoon, you have the actual long-term relationship. And that can look many different ways. And this is one of my favorite things to talk about. And somebody summarized it one of my clients actually summarized it in very briefly. Shift happens. The pun is intended. So change is not linear. And when it comes to psychedelic work, I really do believe that it's nonlinear and there's an unfolding process. And here, this is from a website that I took with permission. And you see that most people have the expectation that it's just a straight dotted line, but in fact, over time, people's progress, there's dips, it goes up and you go down, you feel better, you feel worse, you struggle, your symptoms come back. It's really an ebb and flow. And this is really an integral piece of the integration process, to be aware of that people might be coming in with this kind of expectation. So I want to say that the unfolding process, that wavy line can be challenging, but it's not always. And integration can be very smooth. And not everybody needs to see a psychotherapist for their integration process by any means. I think probably most people don't. An integration can happen in community, with family, with friends. But sometimes it's helpful to know that there are other people out there who may be professionals, and it's a certain, very specific kind of relationship that integration can take place in. And I want to thank all of you for listening, and also all of my clients who've inspired me, who've informed me, who've taught me. And I want to end with a final piece of advice, which is that if you're helping people integrate their experiences, please pay attention to your own expectations for them. What are you expecting of them? Pay attention to your own feelings toward them, to your relationship with them, and be aware of your own expectations of what psychedelic healing can be and your own cultural background that you bring to this work. So if you'd like to learn a little bit more about my work, if you'd like to contact me, here's my information. And thank you again for listening.
Ingmar, thank you so much. What a beautiful talk. I hope you get a chance to browse through some of the comments that came in while you were speaking. People seem to really resonate with what you were sharing. And to everybody in the audience, we've received about 16 questions in the Q&A box so far. So just a reminder that you can go in, you can look at those, you can click the thumbs up if it's a question that you'd like to see answered, and you can enter your own question in there as well. So now we're going to transition to hearing a little bit from Shannon. So Shannon, whenever you're ready.
Thanks, Merete. It's wonderful to be here. Thanks, Ingmar. Wow, you had some beautiful pictures, and I love the graph of the nonlinear process. If that doesn't describe our lives, I don't know what does. It's nice to see a general arc moving up and forward. Yeah, I'll share my screen, and just honored to be here today in your presence, and thanks for having me and giving me space to share. So you should be able to see me, okay. So I'm Shannon Carlin. I'm a marriage family therapist. I work with MPBC, as Merete introduced, and Ryan earlier. I direct the MDMA therapy training program, and also have a small practice through the California Center for Psychedelic Therapy doing ketamine-assisted therapy, which is just really an honor and so rewarding to keep a finger in direct clinical work. I learned so much from that. So integration comes from the Latin root integrare, which is to make whole and to bring together our various parts and components and combine them into wholeness. So I just want to pause here for a minute to invite us in just a couple of moments of reflection. And for me, I'm going to close my eyes for a minute and center my spine. Actually use my hands to feel my breath moving through my body, integrating the inhalation and the exhalation. And I invite you into a moment of just acknowledging all that's present in your sphere right now. Words and narratives, this presentation, things that are happening in the room or the building or the space around you, conversations you had or encounters this morning or earlier today, food you ate that is now integrating to be your very cells. And this air that we integrate into our being and exhale, which integrates into our environment, and inhale, which integrates us into our environment. And welcoming back. So we are constantly integrating ourselves into wholeness. It's a natural thing that we do intrinsically. Our bodies do it without us even intending or trying or practicing, just breathing. Your lungs are going to absorb oxygen and they're going to exhale things that don't serve you, but serve the environment around you. Food, your heartbeat, and our minds do this too. We naturally, when given the right environment, will move towards wholeness, and we can be intentional about that process. And what psychedelic experiences allow us to do is facilitate that process and be intentional with it, to make meaning and to integrate our life experiences. So on one hand, psychedelics bring up new experiences. They bring up content from the unconscious. They connect us with something bigger or deeper or inner of ourselves and of others and of unity. And they also help us understand and make sense of and gain perspective on our own lives, my own identity, my own ego, my own course of events that have happened in my life. And both of those processes flow into one another. And the process of integration is the meaning that we make of that and how we bring that from whatever the experience is, a psychedelic experience, for example, into our daily lives. And hopefully that allows us to be a more complete self. So as Ingmar mentioned, I will talk a bit about the context of integration in MDMA-assisted therapy, which is the predominant research experience of MAPS. And so just want to give you a little orientation on what our course of treatment looks like to kind of frame how integral integration is in our research protocols and the course of treatment. So of course, people go through screening and before they become enrolled in the study. And most of the MAPS MDMA-assisted therapy studies have 3 MDMA sessions. Some have 2, some have different numbers, but many of them have 3. And after every MDMA session, which is the yellow circles, which are 8-hour-long sessions, we have 3 integration sessions, which are each 90 minutes long. And the first one is the very next morning after the MDMA session. Many of our studies, participants show up the morning of their MDMA session. They have the 8-hour therapy. And in a lot of our protocols, they actually stay at the facility overnight, resting. They have a night attendant, and they engage in some of the integration practices we'll talk about in this presentation. And then the next morning, their therapists show back up, sometimes with breakfast. Somebody gives them breakfast, which is also an important part of integration, is nourishing ourselves. And the integration therapy process begins. So as Ingmar touched on, there's a lot of context we're talking about, this is the context of psychotherapy. And unfortunately, we do live in a prohibition culture, and the drug war prevents access to this treatment for many, many people. But this is the framework that we think of integration in the MAPS studies. But when we're working with participants in the research, we think of integration not only as those, 3 90-minute therapy sessions that you're only doing integration for 90 minutes and then you leave and you're not. Integration is a process that a person and a psyche and a body is in. I can't help but saying on almost every call I'm on, I'm 24 weeks pregnant and obviously very proud. And that's a part of me. It's a process I'm in all of the time. And it's not something I can turn on and off. It is something happening inside and through me, much like growth work happens. So what is the purpose of integration? There's certainly no one answer, and I've put a few prompts here, but I'd love to see some of your responses in the chat. what do you think the purpose of integration is, or what purpose has it served for you? Many people say it helps with the continuing unfolding process. It provides support beyond just the hours of the medicine and the medicine session. It allows us to cultivate more insights and deepen and ground insights and realizations and perspective and openness. Allows more content to come out and for us to be able to work with content that has come out. So it could be memories or traumas or realizations or decisions. So healing is an ongoing process. And so is growth work and exploration. I kind of fumbled with these words for a minute because it can be kind of demoralizing to show up to therapy and have your therapist say healing is an ongoing process, because there's suffering. And of course, we don't want to be, and I don't want anyone to be in any needless suffering, and don't believe suffering has to be ongoing. So I just wanted to say that. But the part about we're continuing to learn, we're spiraling back on lessons that we learned previously. We can probably all relate to that, oh, I've been here before. I've learned this lesson before. And we can approach that by saying, maybe there's something new here or something for me to still listen to, or another level or layer. And although the course of treatment, especially in a research protocol, is time limited, the research protocols are incredibly regimented. You can only have 3 MDMA sessions. You can't have a 4th one because drug war. Sorry. And also it's research. But that doesn't mean that the process of growth and healing ends at that course of treatment. Just give me one moment. And so participants in the research are informed at the beginning of treatment that this is an opening process, that it will be ongoing, and that the therapists take responsibility to be present in the process over the course of treatment, and that in any therapy, a clinician is responsible to make sure there's a good handoff at the end of treatment. And that's part of integration too, that we'll talk about. So it's good to be aware. What comes up in my session might be things that I'll be working with for days and weeks afterwards. And that's kind of the point. Integration is part of the process. It's not an extra or an add-on. It is happening, and we can make intentional space for it or not. But we can't unthink the things we think in a psychedelic experience, or the feelings we feel, or the sensations in our body. So that is with us, and what we do with it is our choice. So participants are really encouraged in the psychedelic sessions to, as much as they can, put that analytical mind, the mind that wants to discern, is this right? Is this deep? Is it enough? Am I doing it correctly? Is it too much? Is this, all of the judgment? We really work with people to help them put that part of their mind, as much as they can, soften it and let it sit to the side a little bit during the psychedelic experience, to make room for experience, the experiential part of our humanity versus the analytical part. And the analytical part is not bad. It just tends to like center stage a lot. And in a psychedelic experience, we could miss a lot of the depth of the experience when we get too caught up in our analytic mind. And also sometimes that shows us something too. Wow, my analytical mind is very, very strong. What is that telling me? How can I be curious about that too? And it can be comforting to know that although I'm going to put aside that analytical mind, which is necessary when you're driving a car, you need to discern when to hit the gas and when to hit the brake. And please don't put that part of your mind aside while you're behind the wheel. So we need that part. So sometimes it can feel scary to put that part of ourselves aside. But when people know that integration is the space where I can analyze and dissect and judge. What does that mean? What does it mean for me? What does it look like? Was it a lot? How did it feel? That is part of the integration process, and there will be plenty of time to do it. So it's important we make time to do it. And that the experience comes in waves. So partly integration is about allowing the waves to move through completion and to ripple. Waves come during the experience of the psychedelic, and they come as sensations, thoughts, feelings, insights, all of those things at the same time, sometimes very quickly. And after the integration session, emotions, thoughts, and feelings can come as waves too. So it's good for people to know that. We work a lot with people with post-traumatic stress in the MAPS clinical trials. And so common themes are returning to traumatic events with a high amount of detail to the scenario and situation, which can be really terrifying because our people with PTSD really spend a lot of time in their psyche protecting from that. So integration for someone with trauma might mean that that trauma content could come up in the days and weeks afterwards through dreams, through flashbacks, through just invasive thoughts that you weren't expecting. And so to be prepared for that and to have space again in integration to work through that. I also want to say that joy can happen. I'm talking about anxiety and trauma, that feelings of joy and elation and meaning and purpose can continue well after the hours of a psychedelic session. Again, probably that's the point of why so many people pursue psychedelic experiences. And to be able to make space for that too, that it's really important to find ways for us to make space for joy. It's easy to just be too busy or to discount it because there's so much work still to be done. So I talked about meaning making, and that really happens from inside oneself. I can't tell you what meaning things have for you. And certainly if I sat with you in a psychedelic session, I couldn't tell you what that should mean for you about all the content that came up and how to apply it in your life. But I can be present with you and I can facilitate that conversation that you have with yourself. And so as a clinician, we really work in the inner-directed approach that we train on in MAPS for clinicians to suspend interpretation, assessment, and meaning, but that the participant gets to do that. And of course, it's natural that we have interpretations, but we just hold them as in suspension, that I don't know what something means to someone else. I can be curious about it. And so as a clinician, we give space to ask open-ended questions to participants about what the content of the session and the feelings means to them. What do you make of that? And so the inner healing intelligence really guides that process. That's that intrinsic knowledge within each of us that knows what we know, that knows what we need. It just needs the right context and environment to do that. And so it needs that context in a psychedelic session, one could argue, as well as in integration. If integration is the time that our minds and beings decide what that means about who we are and what we want to do with it in our life, it's a good time to facilitate connection with the inner healing intelligence. I want to give a couple examples, and we're not going to get to go through all of the ones that I have there, but maybe we can do about two. So I put together some examples of some themes that commonly come up in at least the MDMA-assisted therapy work, well, also ketamine work, I would say maybe all psychedelic work. So for example, a theme might come up in the psychedelic session, reconnecting with my inner purpose. And so I just brainstormed a few explorations, open queries that might be part of a person's integration process when the theme of their psychedelic session in part was reconnecting with inner purpose. This is certainly not exhaustive or prescriptive, but just food for thought to kind of put this into application. So if I had a psychedelic session and I really felt like, wow, I'm really reconnecting with my inner purpose of being a co-creator in my garden, with my clients, with my family, and wanting that creative part of myself to come out more. So I might explore an integration. How do I feel? What do I feel in my body when I'm connected to who I am as a creator and that purpose? So I can feel it right now, feel kind of an openness and a lightness in my chest. What am I doing in my daily life when I'm connected to my creativity? Well, I can tell you I'm not sitting at the computer for 12 to 14 hours, but I can tell you what I might be doing is being out in the garden. I'm pulling weeds and picking flowers. I'm in the kitchen trying a new recipe. I am pulling out some of those dusty art supplies in my house. How do I live my daily life aligned with my purpose? So as you can see, all these questions, and I won't go through all of them, can be open-ended questions that I can explore for myself, ways to deepen and ground this theme that came up in the psychedelic session. And it's not that you have to ask these questions. Certainly I could have a psychedelic experience. I'm connected with my inner purpose of creativity, and I move on with my life. But I might lose something without this kind of exploration, that it might not be integrated. I might have another psychedelic experience or another experience to connect me with creativity. Remember your creative part. And then life goes on and it's busy, and I don't connect in an embodied way with that. So I'll just mention the themes I was going to cover without covering them for the sake of time, just so they can be pondering in your head. Sometimes the theme of seeing how my own personality has been shaped around trauma, how much space trauma has occupied in my life, and then integration can be exploring, what does that mean for me? How has that felt? The theme of feeling all the feelings I previously suppressed for good reason to survive. But whoop, suddenly I'm feeling distress and rage and grief that I've been pushing down for 32 years. So it might be helpful to have some support. And finally, the theme of experiencing how much love I have inside of me and around me. So that feels so good. How do we make space for love in our lives? What would you do with that? How does that feel in your body? So some say the hard work of psychedelic healing is what comes after the medicine is worn off. And as you can see, this open inquiry and intentional process of integration can help us navigate that hard work. And healing happens in rest also. So in harm reduction with the Zendo project, we talk about 4 principles of psychedelic harm reduction. And one of them is difficult is not the same as bad. I also like to say difficult is not the same as good. Just because it's hard doesn't necessarily mean it's good for you. There is a difference between pain and suffering. And often we think the best way to improve ourselves is by beating ourselves to perfection. And when I say it that way, it sounds obvious, but rest is important. And I'm going to finish off my thoughts here. To have support can be from a therapist or clinician, from a family member, from our internal resources, meditation, exercise, garden, pets, from faith, from art. And if we are talking about the context of therapy, that there's a lot of support that happens outside of the session, both the therapist being available outside of sessions, as well as participants having these supportive resources outside of sessions. And nothing ever goes away until it teaches us what we need to know. Thanks for letting me share.
Shannon, thank you so much. I definitely saw a lot of people responding positively in the comments, and a bunch of great questions came in. One of them including a desire to have the examples of the open-ended questions shared. So if we can share that as part of the materials in the follow-up, that would be amazing. And I'm sure people would really appreciate that.
Happy to, yeah.
So at this point in the webinar, we're going to switch over to our question and answer section. So I'm going to give folks a couple more minutes to go through and vote on which questions are already in there that you would like to see our panelists answer. And if you have one that's come up for you that you don't see in there, to enter that in. And as we give a few minutes for that, Ingmar and Shannon, I just want to give you a few minutes. I'm sure you obviously have a lot of phenomenal information that you can share with the audience. And I would love to just kind of kick off the conversation between the two of you. One of the questions that came up for me, and I saw reflected in the Q&A, was around, Ingmar, what you brought up around a strong therapeutic relationship being correlated with positive therapeutic outcomes. So I was curious if Shannon and Ingmar, you could just kind of discuss what are some of the hallmarks of a strong therapeutic relationship? And what are some of the ways that you can go about building that from either the clinician perspective or the client perspective?
Sure, I can answer in a very ironically dispassionate way, which is there's people have technically tried to cut this up and examine what it is. One way to talk about it from a technical perspective is that there's agreement between the people who are working together on what is the task that they're engaging in. What's the goal? Like, why? Like, are we aligned in what we're doing here together? That's part of it. And the other part of it is more of what you sort of usually think about in terms of a therapeutic relationship, is that there's empathy, compassion, trust. Trust is a very big piece of that. So that if there isn't trust between you two, then you cannot get to the place that you are trying to go. This is a very kind of goal-oriented way of answering the question, but that's one way that it's been dissected in the literature. I'll leave the warm stuff to Shannon.
I thought that was great. We could talk for hours about therapeutic alliance, but I would say trust. And one of our training cohorts really in a profound way reminded me and all of us to move at the speed of trust. And so trust isn't something we can schedule, but is something that is developed through cultivating relationship and looks different for each relationship.
And maybe also just to use the word love, and that can be, I think we in the trainings with MAPS and what we observe in the studies is that there's love, and that word can evoke a lot of feelings. But what I mean by that is just real genuine care for the other person, and feeling that also from our participants.
Beautiful. Thanks for sharing that. And I know too, if there are any books or resources that we can share following that speak more to the Therapeutic Alliance, I saw some questions around that as well. So one of our questions that has 50 upvotes, by far the most upvoted question we have, is, are there different routes of integration taken for different compounds? For example, is the integration different between MDMA and psilocybin?
It's an interesting question. I'll go first, but Ingmar, I'm also curious to hear what you have to say. When it comes to different compounds, my inclination is that there aren't significant differences. Of course, different traditions have different ways of doing and engaging in integration, whether it's part of ceremony or ritual, or if it's done in a group or individual or family or with a professional or with peers. If it's, what you're doing when you're, I don't know, walking home from a late night party the next morning with a close friend, or if it's 5 psychotherapy sessions you've planned and scheduled with a clinician in advance. So the format can look different, but really it's pretty elegant and simple at a base level, which is that it's any experience, and it doesn't have to be limited to psychedelics either. But psychedelics are such catalysts and have the potential to bring up so much content that it's kind of like moving through life fast forward for a few hours. There's a lot of material suddenly to be working with, and especially material that can be unconscious or somatic or nonverbal, which could really benefit from integration. So I don't see significant differences. There are likely themes, I would guess, of what people reflect on in their psychedelic experience. So, themes of unity or themes of love might come up more frequently with different medicines. Yeah. Ingmar?
Yeah, I agree. I think there are many ways to answer this question, and I'm glad you covered those because I wasn't actually thinking about those. I have a tendency to think very clinically because that's the first thing that comes to my mind because it's what I tend to do. And my first thought was in agreement, maybe not so much between the substances or the compounds or psychedelics, but more so between, if I were thinking really clinically, then maybe in terms of the indications, which really is just another, even more correctly, I think would be like it in the person, that what the integration process looks like to me is less dependent on the psychedelic and more on who the person is and what their life experience has been like and how do they relate to me or to other people. And then maybe, some other perspectives on this would be that I think that there can be unique challenges with very intense experiences that are very short. Tony Moss, who I admire, he recently was talking about how for him, he prefers to work with ayahuasca, but for him, smoked DMT was, I don't want to speak for him, but it was something like, it wasn't so compatible for him to work with that. And from my perspective, there is something, integration can sometimes, when the duration of the experience is longer, there's sort of more room to maneuver in the experience. Whereas when there's something very short and very intense, it can create its own challenge in the integration process. And I by no means want to denigrate those kinds of experiences. I think that can be helpful too, but I think there is something about the sort of the speed and intensity of an experience.
I wanted to say one other thing about that too, which is that the timing of integration, like when does integration happen, how quickly, and when is it done? So I would argue, integration is always ongoing, I guess I would say, and that there can be a sense of completion at some point around an experience or kind of peace with an experience, that things feel settled and resolved and not up. We're familiar when something's up for us as a process. It's kind of, we can feel it in our body, we can feel the emotions. And I've gotten the opportunity to offer integration circles through the Zendo project at festivals, like at Burning Man, and sometimes 60 people show up and sometimes one person shows up, and we're always dusty. And I remember having an experience of being able to integrate for 2 longtime friends who had a psychedelic experience 20 years ago together and had talked about the experience before, but still had some things that were coming up or maybe re-emerging through life events they were going through later in life. So that's that spiral again. We can still learn from experiences so long afterwards. So integration, again, is just so organic. There can be benefit in the short term for sure, because things are so fresh in our minds and in our bodies about the experience. There can also be benefit to integration much later in life.
Thank you so much. So beautifully said. Shannon, you mentioned a little bit about, how different traditions have different integration processes. One of the other highly upvoted questions was, are there indigenous practices from historic shamanic healing rituals that are used and applied in current transcendental integration after a psychedelic experience or psychedelic therapy?
That's a good question. I'm not going to claim to have a good informed response, but I would love to know a more informed response to that question. I will say, in many, especially medicine ceremonies like ayahuasca, and I don't know the roots of this particular practice in ayahuasca, but a lot of ceremonies will have either at the end of the ceremony or the next day a group circle, and sometimes there's even a totem or an object that you hold as you're speaking, and then it passes. And certainly that, again, I don't know all of the history of where that particular practice comes from, but it reflects many indigenous practices that show up around circle work, group process, sharing from your heart, and then even kind of the ritual having an object that has a certain symbolism and moves around in a certain order. And that's the best response I can give. Yeah.
Ingmar, anything to add?
I would just say that, we're all products of some kind of lineage, and there are likely ways that some methods and approaches aren't even kind of just passed on to us. And in this work, I think that, going back to the term trans-theoretical, what we really try to incorporate in our article about integration is that we really have to be culturally congruent. And so, my lineage comes from an psychoanalytic perspective that goes back over 100 years. It's not the only thing that I do, but that's sort of my lineage. And that we need to be really, really careful when and receptive and open and curious for when people come to work with us who come from a different cultural background or seeking something that is more congruent for them. And so it's really important that the integration process or psychedelic therapy isn't conducted at the exclusion of other ways of knowing and other ways of working. And that for people who are seeking more, to use the word shamanic or indigenous practices, that's something that can be accessible to them.
Beautiful. Thanks so much, both. One of the other really interesting questions that I thought came up, Ingmar, related to your talk, was someone asking if you could expand a little bit more about shadow work, what that means, and how that can be explored or addressed or pursued in psychedelic therapy.
Yeah. Well, I really stepped into that one. I'm not a Jungian, but I tend to agree with most of what Jung says. And so this comes from Jung, right? And, the way that I think about the shadow is that when we direct our attention to something, it's sort of the light, right? And so I'll speak for myself and probably many other people who are in the healing, helping professions. We're in the profession because that's what we want to do. We want to help other people, and that's where we shine our light. But if we're not careful, there's something that can grow, or there are parts of us that are not always so focused on, and that might be perhaps a more aggressive part of who we are. And because we want to, well, I help, I don't hurt. But I really am of the belief that all of that potential is within us. And if one is very focused on purely helping with the exclusion of being in touch with other parts of themselves that can be destructive, there can be ways in which the sort of unmet parts of ourselves, those unmet parts, unseen parts, come through. And that can sometimes get in the way of the therapeutic process, but it can also just cause trouble for us in our life. How we get in touch with that, I think, can be through therapy. It can be potentially through psychedelic experiences, but it can also, what I find most helpful is just it's part of our everyday experience. At least it is for me, where I may notice a thought that comes up that is very unlike me, something that I would say, oh, that's terrible. I'll take this risk. I have a 2-year-old daughter, and she is the most, for me, having a child, it absolutely transformed my concept of love. And thinking of something bad happening to her or her being hurt is it's a kind of pain that I've never knew could exist. And yet, there are times where living with a toddler is hard and they push boundaries and they're exploring and they're testing. And it can be really, it can really deplete a person. And, to know that I have the capacity to hurt her. I never have physically, I never have, I wouldn't do that, but it's in me. And I can notice that impulse come up, and how I relate to that impulse is, for me, shadow work. To not say, oh, I can't think that. That to me is the opposite of shadow work. That's the denial of that. There's a way that, sort of welcoming those things in a way and understanding, what is that coming from? What is it saying? What does it need? That's how I do it, but I think there are other ways, and hopefully that kind of illustrates what I mean by it. And I just maybe will add that I sometimes there's so much focus on love in psychedelic, in the community, in the therapy, but this work is not always about love. Sometimes it's about anger, and it's about aggression, and it's about you can feel palpable fear, and so it's that, I think that's something you really want to be in contact with and prepared for.
Beautiful. Thanks so much for sharing so vulnerably, Ingmar, and illuminating that a little further. Shannon, I'm curious if you have any thoughts around shadow work and its role in psychedelic therapy and integration as well.
I'm just I don't know, so excited and inspired by that example, Ingmar. Thank you. And just feel how necessary it is. I spend a lot of the hours of my day focused on how we can better train other clinicians. I think a lot about the clinician and how much clinicians need to do shadow work, especially with psychedelics. And it's something that we incorporate and are always looking to incorporate more of in our training program, is how do we help clinicians be able to break down that shame and taboo that, as a parent, we have shadows, as clinicians, we have shadows, as just by the nature of us being a whole human, we have shadows. And that doesn't make us a quote unquote bad person. So I guess that really comes to acceptance of all of our parts, and parts work shows up a lot in psychedelics. I have one part of me that wants this, and one part of me that wants that, one part of me that loves my mother, one part of me that's just rageful against her. And we reconcile those parts, and we accept that they're all present, and likely they all have a purpose. They all came from somewhere. They didn't just make themselves up. And so when we can be curious about them and allow them, to have a space to talk and share their experience, we're more likely to be able to cultivate a working relationship with them than have them be a monkey over our shoulder. One of the questions I saw in the Q&A was, could you give one, if we had just one thing to take with us, what would be helpful in integration, or what do we do? And we have a couple of handouts we'll send out. One of them is some work that we did with the Zendo project. It's really simple. It's just a 2-page document of, any person can use it with themselves. It has a couple of practices, find mind, body, and art, I think, are the three different practices to do integration, some example integration activities. So you'll get that. But if I was going to say one thing about what's something important to know about doing integration for ourselves and others, is it's the space. It's probably a lot like mindfulness practice. It's the space, it's the time. And it's one of the things I love about the duration of MDMA in particular is I'm spending 8 hours, our clinicians are spending 8 hours with people, and to be able to say this whole day is you, it's your time. And that's true in the integration too, that you're important enough that I'm going to follow up with you and I'm going to sit with you again and again and again. And that could be me saying that to a clinician. That could be me saying that to myself after an experience. This is important enough for me that I'm going to sit with this again. And it can be hard because I think sometimes we want tangible things in the inner directed approach that we work with at MAPS, and that many psychedelic approaches embody. It really comes from inside the client or inside ourselves. And so it's less about some cunning questions or, techniques that you do step A, step B, step C, but really about cultivating that space to be curious and inquiring about ourselves, because what's in there wants to come out, and it will come out if it has space.
Beautifully said, Shannon. And I'm so glad that you brought up that question, because that was one that I had tagged, as I definitely wanted to make sure that I was able to ask you both. And so, Ingmar, I'd love to turn it over to you and ask you, if you could give one practical tip or suggestion in supporting someone in integration, what is that?
I have to think about that, because the one that I wanted to share the most was the one that was at the end of my presentation, which was about being authentic, being present, being vulnerable, but being so much very aware of yourself and what you bring to that work. And that means, I had said, and maybe I could expand on it a little bit, right? Our expectations, and that's, to unpack it, that means that we may have the very best wishes for the person that we're helping to get better. And it's not always that simple and that quick. And how we respond for us, what is that experience like for us to be helping or wanting a certain wish for it to be better or quicker? That's really important to be aware of, because that will impact how you work with that person. And the culture that's sort of connected to that, which is, many of us, as I've alluded to in my talk, I actually said it, right, have had our own experiences with psychedelics, and we may believe what has worked for us is what works for everyone else. And so just being, again, aware of your own assumptions about what the should, to be really, again, careful, kind of holding that. So that would be my advice. It would be to be really aware of what you are bringing to the encounter, and being open. I guess that's the other being curious and being open. Those are big ones.
Curiosity, authenticity, openness, trust are all words that I've heard repeated throughout this session that seem to be really core and key to the integration process. I think we have time for maybe one, maybe two more questions. And one of the ones I've seen come up in a few different ways is around training and education or other kinds of resources that are available for folks who, aren't clinicians, who aren't trained in that just want to learn more and gain a deeper understanding of integration. So I just want to acknowledge everyone who decided to sign up for this webinar, because I think here is a great place to start. But I was wondering, Shannon and Ingmar, if maybe you could talk a little bit about some of the resources that exist out there for folks to learn more, perhaps Sendo Project, Fireside Project, Psychedelic.support, kind of things in that avenue.
Those, yeah, I'll say some of them again. Psychedelic.support has a list of a directory. Yeah, thanks Chelsea for putting it in the chat. Directory of providers doing integration therapy. Fireside Project, zendoproject.org. We will send you some follow-up materials, including that resource sheet I mentioned, which you can use and share to do your own integration or to support other people in theirs. Just some very simple practices. Ingmar?
Yeah, there are psychedelic integration workbooks available online. If you're interested in training, then of course Fluence has a whole focus on psychedelic integration, which is not open. It's open to clinicians, but also to non-clinicians. But there are also others out there. We haven't mentioned psychedelics today. Have quite a large database of resources. Yeah, so I think it makes me very hopeful that there are just so many more resources becoming available by the day.
Yeah, and also there are psychedelic societies that exist all over the world. So looking for one in your region, and if there isn't one that exists in your region, taking the step and maybe starting one in your region is also a great way to kind of connect and learn more with folks around. So we'll do maybe just one more, and this is a future-looking question, and it comes from someone who was a former participant in a MAPS Phase 2 study that found a lot of value from the focus on integration that MAPS took in the study, and that seeing that integration is so vital to the healing process. What can we expect after MAPS's 5-year data exclusivity period ends in terms of how do we ensure that integration is utilized for the safety and full liberation of those with serious mental health struggles moving forward?
I can take a stab at that. It's a complicated question. I think that one way that I would answer it is that we lead with integrity. That MAPS has the opportunity to set the standard, meaning it will be hopefully the first organization to introduce this kind of therapeutic approach, and setting the standard is in the minds of the people who are seeking to do this work. And I'm hoping that can sort of inform the choices that people make in terms of who they choose to work with and the kind of healing modalities that they choose. And I don't know all the details of the political sides of it, but I think that as a trailblazer, MAPS has the opportunity to contribute to the creation of certain standards. And in parallel, Oregon is doing that as well in a different way.
Yeah, thanks so much.
I think it's a really great question.
Yeah, I'll add to that. It's a question that I feel, I don't know, like a sliver responsibility for, directing a training program that's training clinicians to do this work, hoping that FDA and other regulatory agencies will approve it to be more widely available in the coming years. And we often ask ourselves, how do we train a larger and larger number of clinicians and continue to instill the same level of quality and ethic? And it's an ongoing conversation, one that we're deeply immersed in and really enjoy having with our community. And I think, to echo a little bit of what Ingmar said, I think one of the best things we can do, maybe I'll speak from, the MAPS perspective, but also just as people who are leaders in the field now, is to continue to be role models of the quality and ethos, and to not let that slip, that all of our decisions about scaling and growth and drug sales have to be weighed with quality is a premise. It is a requirement. So if any of those decisions impact the quality in a way that would impact treatment outcomes and certainly patient safety, then that's not an acceptable decision that we can make. And those are really difficult decisions to make. You know, how do you maintain quality and deliver this so that people have access? So then you're kind of titrating access and quality, but there are ways to make those decisions, and certainly ways for it to be safe and efficacious. I'll say one other thought. I'm kind of rereading the question because I feel like there's so much here, and thank you for asking this question. I would say too, it's about public education. Somebody was just asking me about the field of ketamine-assisted therapy the other day, and there's a wide range of practices in ketamine-assisted therapy. We can use that as a good case example of different kinds of quality and different kinds of approaches. Some have psychotherapy as part of it, some don't. And there's just a lot out there, and there's not a lot known by the public about those differences. What's the difference between esketamine and generic ketamine? What's the difference between ketamine-assisted psychotherapy and a ketamine session, or ketamine therapy more generically? You know, why would I want to have a therapist on my ketamine session? So for the public to be able to know what those things are is going to be really helpful for other medicines coming down the pipeline. So I think some honest and open questions and conversations about that will be helpful. Yeah.
Beautiful. Thanks so much. I'm glad I got to throw a hard ball at you there at the end.
I would add just one really quick thing, which is, you know, my whole talk was about relationship and maybe more one-on-one, but it's also about community, right? And so there's an aspect of that question, which is about, you know, I guess liberation, to use that word, and what has been often used, what often comes up in this work is community. And the way that psychedelics seem to affect people's lives is that it doesn't just reduce people's symptoms. It changes, has the potential to change how a person is with others, and it reverberates. And so I think that is another kind of aspect that needs to be really stressed, that we're not just treating one person, we're treating communities that are also interconnecting with each other.
Beautifully said. And I think that's a wonderful note for us to kind of take with us into the rest of our days. And I want to invite Ryan back in here to just send us off with some closing thoughts.
Such deep gratitude to our panelists, Shannon, Carlin, Ingmar Gorman. Thank you, Merete, for moderating this webinar. It's been such a pleasure to listen to this conversation, to learn from the experience, the perspective, the wisdom of not only our panelists, but you, the audience. I really do believe it's a big part of our mission at Zendo Project is this is about community. We can't do this alone. It takes all of us. So thanks for bringing what you all bring, your unique gifts and perspectives to the chat and to this deeper work. So I think it's speaking for all of us here in attendance and sharing our gratitude for both of you, Shannon and Ingmar, for the work that you've done, the work that you continue to do to support positive and healthy change in this world. I want to thank everyone in attendance. We hope that this session inspired everyone to bring these conversations to your community, to better understand how we might support this role of integration and healing trauma, psychedelic therapy, and evolving mental health in our world. So I know that Ingmar and Shannon have shared a few resources to connect with the work that they're doing, which we put in the chat earlier, and I believe we're going to paste it into the chat again now. We'd also like to spotlight a group that's doing amazing work with psychedelic support and to some extent integration, who is the Fireside Project. I believe that post has been in there in the chat, so maybe scroll up a little bit. It's firesideproject.org. They've recently launched a psychedelic peer support line. It provides support for people undergoing psychedelic experiences, but also provides integration support. So you can learn more by visiting their website. We also want to remind everyone that your participation in these webinars will continue to support the work that MAPS is doing. Another great way to support MAPS is to give whatever you can through monthly donation. It helps us to predict our funding and makes it possible to pursue our mission. So right now we're running a really cool special MAPS 35th anniversary pen that's available as a gift for the first 1,500 recurring monthly donors. So you can go to maps.org/donate and find out more information about that. Once again, thank you all for attending the 5th webinar in our 6-session series. Join us next week for our final webinar session for Psychedelic Science 2021, MDMA-assisted therapy for couples, featuring Ann Wagner and Annie Mithofer. This will be moderated by Bia, our MAPS public education and cultural specialist. Once again, so grateful for everyone. Thanks for continuing to be part of this community. Thank you for your presence, your participation, the unique perspectives and passions that bring everyone to these sessions and help carry these wisdoms beyond. We hope to see you at our next webinar. Enjoy the rest of your day.